In this video, I want to talk a bit about baking holes and why baking holes doesn't actually work and how to actually fix that problem. So, we have a pretty basic example here. We have a mesh with some boolean cuts in it with a bevel, and this is a flat surface, which means we could bake this really easily. All we'd have to do is add in the same exact surface. So in this case, it was simply a cube moved up, scaled down to 0.1. And this should be a pretty perfect bake because it matches the high poly mesh, this one right here, down to the T. So I'm going to show you the problem with baking holes and why we don't actually want to bake holes. We want to do something else to bake holes, and it's a really easy fix. Let me first show you the issue trying to bake this. So here's the result of that bake. The result is absolutely terrible, and the holes don't actually look like holes. The reason this is happening is because whenever I should probably draw this out on a diagram, I'll do it in a second, but whenever you're baking, there's an array of rays basically coming into the low poly object, projecting through to the high poly, and it eventually has to hit a surface to know when to stop that ray. So I'm going to use my tablet to demonstrate exactly what's happening with these, with the bakes and high poly and rays and all that stuff. So what we have here is our high poly. I'm going to use this little red marker. We're going to paint across, then maybe we have some detail right here on our high poly, maybe a little more detail here, maybe some detail here, very generic example. Okay, so that's our high poly mesh, right? And we're going to have our low poly, which I'll do here in yellow. So the low poly is trying to match the curvature of the high poly as best as possible to get the best results. So what we're going to do here is simply match it. So the low poly is basically going to go straight through because all this detail can be baked. You might have to follow the curvature a little bit depending on where you go. So maybe down here you kind of follow it. I am not the best drawer, so bear with me. But basically this is what's happening. We have our high poly in red and our low poly in yellow. Now what we have next are these rays that come in, and these rays are basically hitting the low poly, hitting the high poly, and taking that high poly detail and using that for the bake information. So basically what's happening here, you have a ray coming in at pretty much all the normal angles for your object, like that. And what's happening is all of these rays are coming in, they're eventually pushing through the low poly. The low poly is usually a bit bigger than the high poly, and then it's hitting the high poly and baking on that high poly detail. Now aside from my awful visual here, it's kind of hard to see where I'm writing with the mic in front of my face, but that's exactly what's happening. So in this example, we have a hole, so there's no like finishing point, right? There's no wall for the rays to hit because it just passes right through the hole. So this is basically an infinite bake, as I like to call it. It's baking, but it's pushing into infinity. There's no sense of actual depth here. So instead of doing something like this, the solution is to do something like this, where we actually have a wall behind it and the cut isn't passing all the way through. This is going to give us a much better bake, and it's also going to prevent that infinite look to it like we have here, where it's like pushing into infinity. So let's go ahead and see how this one looks when we bake it. Now we have a much cleaner bake, as you can see. It's because there's actually something for the rays to hit, and it's not going to kind of pull the hole into infinity. So this is a much cleaner bake. Sometimes in Substance, if that's where you're baking, you will have to tweak the max rear distance button. In this case, I think 0.01 might be too small. Yeah, a little bit too small. And it's going to basically give the same result, but you can actually fix it by tweaking this a little bit. I usually just pull that in arbitrarily until it gives me a nice result. And this is what we have here. This is a very messy and kind of dirty normal map. I haven't really went into much consideration for the cleanliness of it. I just wanted to kind of demonstrate the difference here. This is a lot cleaner. Now if your poly budget is not super high, I would not recommend doing it this way. I would actually recommend doing the original strategy with the holes, but instead on the low poly one I would simply model in the holes but keep them much lower resolution. So maybe this one here that has 3 segments, we could simply make this low poly by perhaps duplicating it and making this a 1-segment bevel instead. That way you actually have the hole modeled in and you're not losing all of that detail. So if you truly want a hole that goes all the way through the mesh, the best way to do that is to simply cut the hole in the low poly mesh. So your two options are to either bake in the hole by making sure there's a wall and the hole isn't going all the way through, or what you can do is model in the hole on the low poly mesh as well, which is what I prefer to do because in my opinion the detail is a lot cleaner. So I just kind of wanted to point that out because sometimes you'll have holes that are so tiny that it's not worth modeling in the detail, but you'll still have those nasty pools, and the best way to fix those is to make sure the hole doesn't go all the way through. So that's about it for this video. Hope it gave some insight, and I'll see you in the next one.